It looks like depending on if he stays in the right lane or the suspect here, we're going to place that they're headed. You know, a lot of times they will head to an area that they are familiar with. You wonder what must be going through their minds. With two kids on board at speeds this high, and now on the 91 freeway, we're headed into the Long Beach area. It's hard to say where they may continue on to, and we always speculate if they may be heading to a spot that they're familiar with, maybe home. We've seen that in several cases.
So we're watching a car chase video from YouTube. I don't know the exact date of it. Looks like November of 2020. Um, just hey, this is LA. There's a car chase video, high speed pursuit on. It seems like every other day. Have you ever wondered whether putting this kind of thing on television encourages this sort of illegal activity? You ever say to yourself, wow, a lot of people see this and know that thousands of eyes, maybe millions of eyes are tuned in to see. You see here that this has over 1 million views. You ever wonder to yourself, can this inspire copycats? What's the relationship between mass media coverage of a car chase and the production of those car chases by ordinary citizens? Drunk ordinary citizens, high ordinary citizens, whatever this fucker's doing right here at 50 odd miles per hour. Um, that's what we're going to be talking about in this class. We want to talk about how mass media influences us. And we come in with beliefs about what media does to us. We may come to believe, for instance, that the coverage of car chases encourages people to go on car chases. That may be a belief that we have. But what if we had to prove it? What if we had to go through and show that footage like this formally and specifically encourages folks to run from the police knowing that they'll be covered? How would we go about formally proving that? Well, you do it through research and the collection of data. But the formalities of presenting that data, when we get down to what experts say about situations like this, are passed down theoretically. There are theories, competing theories as to how this sort of activity you're seeing here impacts viewers' minds. Not human minds. Remember, viewer minds. What does seeing this do to us? This is what our question is going to be to begin with. More generally speaking, we're going to move, this class moves to what does mass media do to us? What does it do? How does it function? We all have sets of beliefs about bad media, don't we? We think, oh, there are certain types of media that lead people to react badly. Maybe we're thinking here in the 90s that the hysteria was about, and the theorizing was about gangster rap. Did gangster rap encourage people in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s? Did gangster rap encourage people to join gangs or be violent or buy guns? Okay. How did that work? How does that work? We do have these beliefs, but turning a belief into an academic project takes a degree of formality we're not necessarily prepared for. We take our beliefs as seriously as we take our theories. We may have informal theories about, I'm watching this guy, he's distracting me at 35 miles an hour. This does go on for 56 minutes. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but I wanted to start with something visual because this is a piece of data, a video from ABC 7 in Los Angeles. That's our local ABC channel 7. And I have no idea how this car chase ends. We're just looking at it as, what does it mean? Now, back to this idea. We all end up in this position where we make our beliefs clear to ourselves. Look, what NWA or Future or any number of rappers. We could also talk heavy metal here. There was a famous lawsuit in the 1980s in which a man who attempted suicide after listening to a Judas Priest song sued Judas Priest with the idea that they wouldn't have attempted suicide if they hadn't been exposed to a particular Judas Priest song. Okay. There's a set of formalities attached to proving that. Yeah, there will be claims, oh, I heard the song, these particular lyrics inspired me, so on and so forth. But this idea that mass media is bad for us, particular forms of mass media, particular songs or movies or video games are bad for us, indicates a degree of belief. But what does it mean to formally prove it? How do I formally prove logically, academically, that car chases inspire other people to go on car chases? Well, I would have to look at it very, very closely. I'd have to research it. I'd have to gather data about car chases. And I'd want to see the videos. I'd want to talk to ideally, I'd talk to the folks who are chased in the video and ask them, why'd you do it, dude? Or gal. I guess women will go on these too. Or, talk to some gangsta thug and say, so what does Tupac have to do with your activities on this particular day? And what we're recognizing here is that, you got your notebooks ready? Because we're about to get into some things. You got your writing space? Are you in a space where you can write and think? That's all part of your writing process. The writing process you started developing in your previous English course in freshman composition first semester. Your writing process must be taking notes. So are you in a spot to take notes? Because we're about to undertake this activity. A lecture. So let's examine our own views here. What media is bad? Bad for viewers. Now, I'm asking you a complex question. We have to define what's bad, of course. What do we mean by bad? Here, the production of another car chase inspired by a previous car chase. But we also have to think about who. Because a lot of the theories, let's go with video games here. A lot of the theories about the dangers of video games have to do with the ages and genders of the viewership, of the players. That certain individuals are particularly, susceptible to media messages. Is Grand Theft Auto bad for teenagers? Look, it doesn't produce in every single one of them the desire to go mug a prostitute and take her money. Grand Theft Auto doesn't do that. But it would, in theory, in my belief, cause certain individuals to react badly. And I need to be clear on who those individuals are, specifically, what messages they're responding to, and what does when we refer to bad, that it does bad, what does this do to them? We need to clarify that. In order to do so, in order to move from informal belief to formal theory, we need to recognize what theory is. So let's begin by jumping into our discussions at our Canvas page. There's our Canvas home page. Clicking on discussions and going to add some discussion here about theory, because that's what we're talking about. There's a video we're going to see. I'll present the video when it's timely. But to begin with, I want to know, what is this applied formality that we call theory? Where does it come from? How does it work? How do we work theory in an academic setting? It's important because we can't just simply state what we believe. We need to back up what we believe by keeping track of data, definitions, categories. We've got a lot of things to keep track of. Like I said, this very outwardly simple question of what media is bad for people indicates that you must tell us what people and what you mean by bad and specify the media message. So how do you go about making your beliefs into theory? How do you use theory to prove your belief is correct or incorrect? Well, let's begin by recognizing that whatever we think about the bad that can happen when certain people encounter certain media images or messages, we want to talk about theory in this way. Theory, which is what you'll be applying a lot as you do your academic career as an undergraduate, and particularly it kicks in as you're a graduate. But we can talk about how theory is so important, and we will, to upper division classes. Theory is defined by my work as sets of statements asserting relationships among classes of variables. That's a formal definition of it. Now, what theory does is it sorts the variables. It picks up the data points that matter towards the theory while excluding data points that don't. So let's look at this. Every theory, whether it's a theory for English literature, a theory for physics, a theory for sociology, administration of justice, linguistics, cultural anthropology, all theories do the same thing. Every theory features, I'm sorry you're seeing me type this, but you're seeing me type this because I've never formally put this online. I've always taught IRL. I've been teaching this class, I just calculated it this morning, since 1992. This class started as a Journalism 101 class emphasizing literacy among different forms of presentation, whether it's writing or film or radio or whatever it is. Every theory features categories. And as I type here, I appreciate your patience. Definitions and assertions about cause and process. The invisible part, look, I can show there's not a lot of invisible things that, well, how shall I put this? Let me put it this way. If someone slaps me and I say, ow, you can clearly see that the slap caused me to say, ow. But if you don't know the formal ways in which pain works and psychological trauma works, you may not understand fully the connections between the slap and my saying ow. So what you do is you'd work with categories of attacks, categories of reactions, definitions of what a slap is, and what the word ow, where the word ow comes from, its origins. We can think here just in terms of the history of words. In particular, this is an onomatopoetic word, ow. It is a word that appears on the page, an echo of what we say out loud. Okay, so every theory features categories, definitions, and assertions, particularly about cause and process. These tend to be invisible. What is the relationship between car chases and inspiring more car chases? Specifically, what is the connection between mass media presentation of car chases and inspiring folks to go and get in a car chase? See, we've got theories here, but what theory works like algorithms. Theory is algorithmic in the way it treats data. It seeks to apply logic, connections, and so on and so forth, to data. It works by including and excluding data for reasons that are established through the history of the theory. It works by including and excluding data. Data here could refer to statistics, stories, expert opinion, but it always produces the same thing. It produces the logic of what is invisible to the ordinary viewer, the casual viewer. We may watch this video of this SUV. Now he's at 45 miles per hour, and that looks like, I don't know, is that somewhere in the South Bay? Are we going over the bridge there? I don't know. But anyway, your theories are going to be based on looking at data points. A good metaphor for theory is an Excel program. Excel allows you to pile up data and then to sort that data. Theory does the same thing. There are rules. there are assertions, there are categories and definitions. Let me add the word rules here. Okay. So when we say, oh, gangster rap affects teenagers and makes them more violent, or Grand Theft Auto affects, again, teenagers, I'm thinking again here, and makes them more violent, we would gather data to see if we were correct. This is a main goal of your undergraduate work, is gathering data in support of, or to contradict for that matter, theories. Theories contain expectations and goals, so we'd want to check them. Can I make a theory? The most basic forms would be to explain a phenomenon, would be to explain connections in data that is otherwise invisible to us when we are simply at our leisure. Theory is formal. It really narrows things down. It tells you exactly what to pay attention to and what to ignore. There's a theory called Marxism, and Marxism says, yeah, there's racism, yeah, there's colonialism, but the main ism is classism. So if we're writing from a Marxist perspective, adhering to Marxist theory, we would be looking at the way classes interact, economic classes interact, particularly the interactions between the producing class and the ownership class. These matter. These categories matter if you're writing in and about Marxist theory, okay? You don't want to get turned around and apply Marxist theory based on some vague nonsense or some vague sense that it works like X, when in fact it definitely has to be involved in X, Y, and Z to come across. The relationship, for instance, between racism and classicism is one that is frequently up for dispute among Marxist theorists. We'd want to know that this is a dispute about categories, rules, definitions, and assertions. Let me explain something to you in this way too. Let me switch my pause. Let me switch my share. Our formal textbook, the first one that we really deal in, Channels of Discourse Reassembled, is an interesting book. It breaks down theories of television, that there are ways of looking at phenomenon that rule out other ways of looking, that support other ways of looking, so on and so forth. And within this book, you'll find that by chapter, it's organized by theory. Here's what I'm talking about. I took this photo earlier this morning. There it is. Make it a little bigger, maybe, hopefully. There it is. Look, there's me poking out from behind, using my face to keep myself from shaking while I take a still photo. Look at what's going on in this book about television. A book that is now 30 years old, by the way. But the theories hold up, and the examples may get dated, but the theories hold up. There's a theory that is dealt with in chapter 1, Ellen Sider's chapter on semiotics, structuralism, and television. We need to know exactly how to approach television through these structures, using their manners, using their process. If we look at television semiotically or through structuralism, we're going to notice certain data, and it will produce certain results, usually involving explaining or predicting. We'll get to breaking that down here in a minute. Then we have narrative theory, which is theory of how people tell stories. Look, this gentleman is still rolling along here. I assume it's a gentleman. television serves as a kind of storyteller, but it's not really like storytelling. The application of narrative theory indicates that their television tells stories, but tells it in particular ways, maybe to particular results. We could explain these results, we could explain or predict results, so on and so forth, through through television's storytelling mechanism, its narrative. There's also a theory in this book. You see what this book is doing? It's switching theories by chapter, called audience-oriented criticism, which is related to narrative theory, but is its own distinct category. And this is, how do storytellers in audience-oriented criticism and television, you'll learn this in this chapter, how is it that audiences relate to stories and storytelling? Is it different relating to a live piece of data, a live television footage, than it is in dealing with information that we're picking up on video? I mean, right off the bat, if I'm doing a live presentation for an audience, and that audience doesn't like it, they can boo me. They can walk out. They can scream, "Fuck you, asshole," and that would interrupt my flow and interrupt my storytelling. But if you're watching a piece of video, you can't do that. Just, you're experiencing this right now, aren't you? You don't know where to pause my presentation. I'd recommend pausing frequently, by the way. Just a little bit of good writing conduct there. The genre studies involved in the Allen book. Ideological analysis is going to play a very big role later on in the semester. Psychoanalysis and Freud. What does Freud tell us about the unconscious, and how does that relate to television? Now, Freud existed in a time when television and film didn't exist. He lived until the 1930s, so he saw film in particular. But there's a whole theoretical exploration of what psychoanalysis does in explaining how film is effective, how film works, how it affects our conscious as well as unconscious thoughts. And this involves paying attention to interactions on the screen in a film or in television, paying attention to images, words, so on and so forth. You know, film and television are multimedia. There's an audio track and there's a visual track. We can split the visual track again. We can say the visual track is not just the images we're shown, but the way they're put together. Editing is a visual way, a visual treatment of audio, of television, of film. You see here two feminist British cultural studies, which implies the existence of an American form of cultural studies in television. And then we've got this theory called postmodernism. We're not going to go through all of these. The main ones we will go through will be semiotics, narrative, audience-oriented criticism, and ideological analysis. And we'll go through them piece by piece. What you need to know is that the syllabus tells you what you should have read by now. But this book is theoretical. The data doesn't change. It just keeps looking at television. It looks at different parts of television, different programs, so on and so forth. But we can approach television in not necessarily exclusive forms as structural. We can approach it structurally. We can approach it narratively, always looking at data that television produces, sometimes even the same data. I can use the same data for structuralism, a structuralist critique, as I can for an audience-oriented critique. An audience-oriented critique could be used to help with establish feminist theories of this. So we see here in our book this very thing. That theory breaks down data according to categories, rules, definitions, and assertions. Sometimes, let's just put it this way, sometimes it breaks down ideologically, which has to do with connecting to our belief system, particularly the way we were taught to believe. Um, yeah, so we're going to get heavily into that. Let's go. Let's understand what theory is going to mean to you based on schooling, because this is where we're at, right? We're all in college. We want to recognize that every department has its theories. Every speciality in academia features theory. Um, for instance, in psychology, we have theories of child development. There are theories about when children hit certain behavioral or thinking targets. Um, it is a set of definitions. We define what the terrible twos are. Okay. And then we ask, what are the rules that produce the terrible twos? Is it a social thing? Is it developed because mom and dad act this way? Or is it something more genetic and more natural? So if we're studying child development, we're going to see child development theories, theories that compete, theories that help, that push each other to evolve, okay? Theories that rhyme and deepen established relationships, these invisible relationships that theory accounts for, these explanations, these predictions, okay? So let us see, before I move on, history as an avocation, as a specialty, as a major, contains a number of theories. I've just discussed one called Marxism. Marxism says that history functions in a particular way. It's always gravitating towards class warfare. Okay. Um, uh, so that means that when you look at a particular era of history, you're always looking at class warfare. You're always looking at conflict between the producing class and the ownership class. Theory also involves in history, there's something called the domino theory that was predominant before it became so obviously bogus. It was revealed to be complete bullshit. There's a theory post World War II when we were trying to explain why small countries were going communist, particularly countries in Southeast Asia like Vietnam. And one of these theories as to what was going on historically in Vietnam as it was fighting for its independence on a parallel track to becoming a communist nation. One of these theories we had was called the domino theory. And like a lot of theory, it insists upon us through a metaphor. Domino theory. So this really is, why does Vietnam become communist? Because it falls like a domino. First, a neighboring country becomes communist. And then as that nation falls to communism, Vietnam is going to fall to communism. And if Vietnam falls to communism, Cambodia is going to fall to communism, and so on and so forth. It didn't work this way, but it was there in existence after World War II, particularly between 1945 and say 1960. It asserted that one nation becoming communist means that all nations around it will become communist. The realities of history didn't turn out that way. So here was an incorrect theory. We need to recognize that theories are checked by reality, by experience, by data, okay? So domino theory, there we go. In history, you would learn about domino theory. It is a way of thinking about history that organizes it more or less along realistic lines. That more or less matters a lot. You need to check your data, okay? And data here refers to the statistics, the stories, the history, the expert opinion, so on and so forth. All right. Let us now move to, I hope we have our notebooks out. What is theory? This is an analytic lecture. It's about 10 or 12 minutes long. I like this presentation a lot. I will give you video presentations as I would if we were working in real life, IRL. But this one I like a lot. I hope you have your notebooks out. When we're done with this, I'm either going to stop this particular Zoom call / YouTube video and start a new one, or I will continue on with what would be briefer notes about theory. But here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, theory testing and building, a 15-minute presentation by Alexander W. Weissman, a PhD, appearing at the site www.comparative-education.com. And here's his presentation of what is theory? What's it do? What are types of theories? What does it come from? When we're done with this, I want to talk about the history of theories generally. And then by the end of today, we will be discussing specifically mass media theory, what it does, what it intends to do. Dude is still on a roll here. We still got a few minutes left. We're going to say goodbye to him. I hope he got what he deserved. My theory is that he did. Oh, my belief is that he did, maybe. Here we go. So, Theory Testing and Building by Dr. Weissman. Have your notebooks at the ready. I will pause every once in a while to make specific points about what theory is and how it works and what it does for us and how it changes thinking. Let's turn on the subtitles and away we go.
Hey everybody, my name is Alex Weissman. We're going to be talking today about theory testing and theory building. This is something that we've been discussing in a couple of the classes that I'm teaching. And it's also, I think, an interesting topic all by itself. So let's give it a shot and see if we can find out. What we're going to do is we're going to go over a couple of different things in basically 3 sections. The first section, we're going to talk a little bit about what theory is. Specifically, we're talking about social science theory. And even more specifically, I'm going to be talking about, or at least thinking about, theory that is relevant to comparative and international education research. Then we're going to spend some time talking about theory testing, and we're going to spend some time talking about theory building. So that is the basic overview. Could not be more straightforward. I would like to point out that I'm going to be focusing on the information from 2 different sources. One is this Colquitt and Zapata-Phelan article from 2007. It's something that I have assigned for one of the classes that I'm teaching, the doctoral seminar, and I think it's a very good introduction to the idea of theory building and theory testing and how to look for that in the things that you're reading. The other thing that we're going to be taking a lot of information from today is this online textbook by Bhattacharjee called Social Science Research Principle Methods and Practices. Specifically, there is a section on theory and theory building and theory testing. So I will be borrowing heavily and quoting extensively from these 2 sources. Please do assume that all of the information comes from them and that I'm just putting my own spin on it.
Just a brief pause here. This dude has the sniffles. It is a bit distracting, but it's not terrible. And I probably shouldn't have pointed it out to you. There's a theory called the white van theory. That is that if you point out connections and phenomena to people, it always makes sense. Like, for instance, this white van theory works like this. If I point out to a group of people, or let's say an individual, that a white van is following them, or that white vans are following them, they'll go out into the world and they'll notice white vans, not necessarily proving that they're being followed, but there's a lot of fucking white vans out there, right? So if I teach you to think in a particular way, you will notice things in particular ways. That's kind of what theory works. How theory works. The white van theory point is a perception theory, a psychological theory. sociological theory. Theories exist in multiple genres, in multiple academic specializations. Marxism plays a role for sociology, as well as history, as well as social psychology. So, onward with our discussion here, keeping in mind what theory does.
So let's start out with the basics. What is a theory? Well, it's hard not to get a little distracted by the bold part down here. We could say on the surface, or at least to begin with, theory should explain why things happen rather than just describe or predict. This why things happen is going to be very important.
Yep, there's that sniffle. The emphasis I want to put here is that fundamentally, when we explain why, we're always in an argument. Why is making invisible connections? What's the relationship between drought in California and climate change on a global level? If we make the connections, we're making an argument. We learned this early in English 101, 110, whatever the English class you had before this was. You learn to focus and unify around points of view and staying consistent. Well, here we're going to remain consistent through explaining why certain data connects and why things happen, as you see there. So onward with this presentation. We're again picking up on what you learned in English 1, where you learned to expound in a unified way about data, where you were asked to agree or disagree with a way of looking. And theories are ways of looking, okay? Should cell phones be banned on trails in national parks? Should California ban cell phones on trails in national parks? Agree or disagree? Okay. Should they be? Yes. Should they be? No. You don't do both. In an academic paper, you don't cover both bases. You stay theoretically within the lines. Another way of thinking about theory, and we'll keep coming back to this, is this idea that theory is framework, that a theory frames data. It tells us what data we're going to put within the frame and what data gets pushed out of the frame by its rules, by its definitions, by its assertions, by its algorithms, if you will. Theory is a kind of mental, intellectual algorithm. It sorts. Onward.
And if we want to, we can borrow a definition from Bacharach in 1989, who says theories are explanations of a natural or social behavior, event, or phenomenon. It's a way to explain a social phenomenon or an educational phenomenon or a comparative and international education phenomenon.
Are we taking notes? We need to make sure we're taking notes. Pause the video presentation, pause my presentation as I'm pausing this video, this YouTube video, and write down in your notebooks what you're seeing here. I'm going to give you a related but contrasting, in fact, I already have, explanation of what theories are and what they do. His version is not exactly the same as mine. Mine have to do with asserting relations between phenomenon, between data. His goes a little different, explains why things happen. I like his, I like mine, but they emphasize different things. They do not just describe or predict.
And if we get more specific or more formal, we can say that a scientific theory is a system of constructs, which we can also call concepts, and propositions, which indicate the relationships between these constructs, that collectively presents a logical, systematic, and coherent explanation of the phenomenon of interest within some assumptions and boundary conditions.
Write it down.
So I'm just going to underline a couple of the key things. We'll actually come back to these. These will end up being our 4 elements of a theory: constructs, propositions, logic, and boundary conditions. But if we were to remember simply that it's an explanation of a phenomenon, that would be good enough. Now, let me pause for a second here and say what a theory is not. A theory does not equal, let's see, my handwriting's not so great on this, an ideology.
Now, just to complicate matters for you, I disagree on his definition of ideology. In fact, there is a chapter in the channel's book deals in television and ideology. This version of ideology he's referring to is more of the general sense. In the sociological and economic realms, ideology is a very specific thing. It's not just a set of beliefs. Ideology is the beliefs of a bourgeois class as they normalize, and ideology always normalizes activities. It tells us what activities are in relation to other activities, between right and wrong, between good and bad, so on and so forth. Ideology is a check like that. However, in this theory discussion, he's using ideology along the lines of what is more generally understood, not the specialty one that we're about to encounter with television, but the general one that people understand. Ideology is a belief system.
Takes me a while to write, sorry. In other words, a theory is not a belief. It has to be somehow testable. And that is going to be the important part. It needs to be empirically testable. An ideology, you can just believe it. You don't need to have any data or evidence. You don't have to have anybody else who even believes it along with you. It can just be your belief, your idea, your ideology. What we're saying is that a theory is something that is much more bounded by data than that. If there isn't data that can be used to support it or to confirm it or to deny it or to deconstruct it, then it isn't a theory. It's just an ideology. There are different scopes for theories. Sometimes we call this macro and micro. I actually like the specific terminology a little better. So ideographic, which we might call micro, and nomothetic, which we might call macro, are 2 ways of thinking about the scope of a theory. With ideographic theory explains a single situation or event in idiosyncratic detail. So if I want to be able to explain why I have a cold today, then I'm going to be able to collect all sorts of information about, well, I didn't take my vitamins, and I didn't eat very well last week, and I'm short on sleep, and I'm stressed about an upcoming project, and I shook hands with a guy who was all sneezy. I mean, you can find all this data about that specific event. But the problem with ideographic theory is that it's not very generalizable. That's why we have generalizability down here, because that is sometimes the key distinction between these two when we're talking about not just scope, but also what do we do with it. So ideographic theory can tell me everything I want to know. It can be very detailed, very specific, very valid about a situation. In other words, me having a cold. Whereas it wouldn't be able to be generalized to a larger group. In other words, I couldn't say that everybody in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where I'm sitting right now, has a cold because of the same conditions or as a result of the same combination of factors. That would not be something I could get from ideographic theory. A nomothetic theory, however, explains a class of situations or events rather than a specific situation or event. This means that it's going to be looking at what are the conditions in the broader context, if we're going to stick to the cold thing, that would cause multiple people in the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania area to have a cold during this time of the year. Maybe it has to do with the change in temperature that occurs annually. Maybe it has to do with the pollen in the air or other allergens. Maybe it has to do with the population percentage that has a cold or is contagious typically during this kind of year. I mean, there are other factors that we could look at. We could find empirical data on it. it would actually be quite generalizable, because we could say, well, these are factors that apply to a broader context, a broader population, a much bigger sample. But it wouldn't be very specific or detailed. In other words, it might miss the exact combination of factors that gave me a cold versus somebody else a cold. So we have two ways of thinking about the scope of theory, and then the what we can do with that theory, how we can frame it. One is idiographic and one is nomothetic. And we've got the idea that there's a distinction between a theory and an ideology. A theory is an explanation of a phenomenon. It's made up of constructs, propositions, logic, and boundary conditions, and it has to be empirically testable. An ideology could have those sorts of elements still to it, but it's not necessarily empirically testable, and it's not necessarily going to have all of these elements in it. All right, let's keep charging ahead. What are the benefits of theory? Well, there are a lot of good reasons why we would want to include theory, and I'm just going to pause for a moment here and suggest that it is really theory that sets apart good research from great research. Without a theory, usually researchers don't really know what they're looking at. They don't have an explanation for what is happening. And that seems to be often the point of good research, is to not just be able to predict or estimate, because we can do that with data without having any theory. The point is to understand what the phenomenon is, what's actually happening. So the benefits of a theory: one, it provides an underlying logic for whatever the phenomenon is. That helps us understand it from just a basic perspective. What is the underlying logic? Second, it aids in sense making through strategic synthesis of empirical data. Here we have the empirical data part, and we have the idea that we're trying to make sense of a phenomenon with the logic and with the data. Third, it identifies constructs and relationships that might be worthy of further research. So if you have a theory that is explaining why a particular phenomenon happens, it can also help you understand what are some of the constructs or factors, what are some of the relationships that are out there that are relevant for that particular phenomenon that might need to be investigated further. In other words, it provides a platform and a network for research, rather than just being we have some data and we can see what happens with the data. And then fourth, it contributes to our cumulative knowledge by bridging gaps or causing a reevaluation of phenomena. One of the cool things about theory is that it doesn't just stand alone. It builds on other work that's out there, other things that have been established and decided and understood about particular phenomena, so that we can now test those, or we can build new theories that will help us bridge gaps or reevaluate what we thought we knew. Very important stuff. There are limitations to theory, however. For one,
back it up. Hope didn't back up far enough. I wanted to discuss how these apply. Let's discuss how these apply to, let's do domino theory, this idea that countries go through revolutions, and it's a lot like a game of dominoes, where one domino falls, a country falls, and another domino falls, another neighboring country falls, so on and so forth. So what we've got here is an understanding based on domino theory that the underlying logic of government change and revolution is similar to the logic of a game of dominoes. Is it really? Well, this is a convenient way of thinking. This is a convenient theory. It is a way of organizing data that indicates, explains, and predicts outcomes. That the outcomes didn't work out, that today Thailand is not communist, indicates that the proposed logic of the domino theory didn't work out. Maybe international relations aren't like a game of dominoes. It aids in sense making, though, through strategic synthesis of empirical data. So we looked and we said empirically China fell. All right, when China became communist and declared it and began its pursuit of its independence away from the colonial powers of the West, what ended up happening was the appearance of empirical data. Forms of government changed, leadership moved from one position to another, leadership was replaced, and leadership rose up. Again, it aids, this domino theory aids in this strategic synthesis of making connections between empirical data. Does it? Does it really? Is the express sense making that when China falls, Vietnam falls? When China becomes communist, Vietnam becomes communist? Does the domino theory really help us beyond the initial sense making? All right, it identifies and constructs relationships worthy of further research. Yeah, it would allow us to focus on certain events and certain personalities and certain dates and certain laws and government changes and so on and so forth. It allows us to explore for further research how Mao's rise to communist power in China related to Ho Chi Minh's rise in Vietnam. It allows us to notice that, for instance, according to domino theory, it doesn't really matter what Ho Chi Minh believed. It matters more that Vietnam is proximate to China. Questionable, but there, it is a theory. It's now a theory that's been debunked. We need to recognize that theories are challenged by the collection of phenomenon, and it contributes. Look, theory's going to contribute to cumulative knowledge by bridging gaps and causing reevaluation of phenomena. So the domino theory came into existence after World War II with all the ideological conflicts between East and West, between communism and capitalism, between Russia and America, or for that matter, between Russia and China. Even though they're communists, they weren't on the same page. This theory, domino theory, would be adding to cumulative knowledge that bridges the mysteries, that explains the mysteries, that bridges the gaps and causes reevaluation of phenomena. It does just that.
Phenomena, so that we can now test those, or we can build new theories that will help us bridge gaps or reevaluate what we thought we knew. Very important stuff. There are limitations to theory, however. For one, they can provide very simplified explanations of reality. So they might not be the most adequate explanations of a phenomenon. One of the reasons for this is we try to create theories that rely on as few variables as possible, or few constructs as possible. The ones that, you'll see this when we talk about building and testing theory later, the theories that use the fewest number of constructs or variables tend to be the best, especially if they're accurate, right? So anybody can make something complex, but the key is, can you find a very simple explanation? Problem being, may not be a completely adequate explanation. What that means is that since they're designed to be simple and parsimonious like that, in other words, focusing on just one or a particular element, they often are only taking a slice of reality, because we know that reality is a much more complex undertaking than simply looking at one or two factors. So that's a real limitation of theory. Reality is complex. Reality has a lot going on. In theory, we try to silo, or we try to take a slice of what's happening and explain that slice. And because we do that, this focused or limited range of vision can actually mean that we miss important concepts out of our particular theory scope. So for example, if we're working with an ideographic theory, then we're missing things that are happening at the macro level or across different situations. If we're taking a nomothetic approach, then we're missing the specific details that are occurring in unique situations and contexts all over the place within our broader macro scope. All right, So we have talked about what theory is. We have talked about some of the different kinds of theory. We talked about the benefits and the limitations of theory. Let's talk about the elements of theory, and then we will end this screencast and go on to the next one. 4 elements of theory that we should be aware of. One is constructs, which is the what of theories. What concepts are important for explaining a phenomenon? If we have a particular phenomenon in mind, it's the what are the things that are obvious to us about this? You have a cold, there is, it's cold and flu season, there are particular characteristics of this, whatever. Another element of theory is propositions. This is the how of theory. So it shows how the concepts are related to each other. So if we have concept 1 and we have concept 2, the propositions show what this connector is. So these are the relationships, a very important part. In fact, I would argue this is one of the most important parts. Third is logic, which is the why of theory. So why are these concepts related? So we've got concept 1, we've got concept 2, we've got how they're related. Now we need to explain why that how exists, why that happens the way that it does. So again, this is also one of the most important parts of theory. If it were up to me, I would say that these are the 2 elements of theory, but it's not up to me. And then fourth, we have boundary conditions or assumptions, which is the who, when, and where of theory. Basically tells us what the context is and under what circumstances will these concepts and relationships work. It's necessary because it also provides us with the scope. It helps us understand what we're doing and how we're doing it, who we're doing it, what the situation is like, so that we can think about how this might apply in other situations as well.
I wanted to pause on this slide and again talk about this domino theory. The construction of domino theory seeks to explain how communism comes to government power. Okay, the propositions here involve theories of how it is that revolutionaries choose in Southeast Asia in the post-war period, post-World War II period, how they're choosing communism over capitalism. The logic is why they're doing it. The boundary conditions here, the assumptions that Southeast Asia is somehow different in its history, in its government making, in its revolutions than the rest of the world is. These are all reasons why we don't believe in domino theory anymore, why domino theory has been largely discredited among historians. But let's wrap this up and then we'll wrap up today's lecture.
Okay, we have just spent the last 15 minutes doing this, talking about in a very summary fashion, what is theory, what are the benefits, what are the limitations, what are the elements. We're going to come back with 2 more screencasts looking at theory testing and theory building. See you shortly.
There we go. There we go. All right. So theory is sets of statements asserting relationships among classes of variables. He had a slightly different version, but there's some overlap between the 2 of them. It's like a Venn diagram. They both stand on what can be assumed based on data, particularly real world data. And we want to know that every theory features categories, rules, definitions, and assertions about cause and process. And we need to know each theory's individual categories, its individual rules, and so on and so forth. Theory in that way works like an algorithm. It tells us, it applies logic to data, explains and predicts based on data. It includes and excludes by its very demands. Certain data would be included and certain data would be excluded. And data can be any sort of information, a statistic, a number, a story, expert opinion. Yeah, so there you go. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. I wanted us to see where we're going next. Our next step is to account for, with theory, a particular phenomena that occurred 80 years ago, 90 years ago now. And that is a phenomenon that became known as the War of the Worlds radio broadcast panic. Keep an eye open. I will give I'll run a module here in the first week. It'll be week 1 module regarding this broadcast, which occurred in the 1930s, a fake radio play that caused its listeners a fake radio play of War of the Worlds, the H.G. Wells science fiction story about the invasion of America by the Martians. People listened to this and they thought it was real. We want to account for, theoretically, why they thought it was real. So I'll present to you in the module the actual radio show, which is on YouTube. And then I'll ask a specific question, and I'd ask you to join in the discussion with your answer to my question. Okay. The essential question is, what's in this show that caused people to panic? Okay. That's the essential question you're going to get when you finally are exposed to it. And you'd want to sit with a notebook and gather your data, thinking about, how does this fool people? This is a radio play. It's not real. But people treated it like a fucking documentary. What is that about? That's where theory kicks in. Okay. So keep an eye on your modules and your syllabus. I'll add one more module for week 1 involving War of the Worlds. And I thank you for your patience. We will see you around the bend. Go ahead and jump into discussions if you've got a question. We've already are starting to develop our discussions pages. All right, guys. Fantastic seeing y'all today. We will see you soon. Bye.